So at the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Sarah Hyndman, designer, researcher who specializes in how fonts and the appearance of words influence our subconscious decisions. Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you at the studio.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversations.
Well, we've met obviously several years ago. I mean, we were just discussing how I think it must have, so when was it? Around 2013, I'm guessing that we met.
2013, 2014.
Yeah.
So very early days of Kitchen Theory.
Very early days of Kitchen Theory. We were working and still are obviously working with Professor Spence, who you've obviously subsequently done quite a bit of research and work with.
Correct.
What is it that I guess got you into this quite niche specialist area of appreciating the power that fonts can have over our kind of our behavior?
Because it's not niche. It's kind of this internal scream that everybody says, oh, that's so niche. But if you start paying attention to the everyday world we live in right now, words are kind of the interface between us and so much of what we experience. It's just something about the way the subconscious brain interacts with words that you don't pay attention to them. So my field of interest is very much stepping away from being a graphic designer and looking at how every single one of us consumes words in our everyday lives, and how everything from the shapes and how we respond to those on a very, very instinctive level, all the way through to the layers of social meanings that we read incredibly instinctively. So once you start to unpick those, and also once you start to ask people to respond, the look of surprise on their faces that, oh, actually, I've got this really complex set of understanding that I can refer to. I just didn't know it was in there.
You use the word consume, and I also realized that your website is type tasting. Why all the food flavor references there? Why is it that we consume words?
So I think especially today, because of packaging, we've been taught so much about, firstly, language. So if you think about a Marks and Spencer's ad, it's not just chocolate. This is chocolate pudding drizzled in, and an understanding of how language very much evokes your senses. I saw that you had A Linguist Reads the Menu book on your shelves, which I think is the most wonderful book, because it looks at how language triggers different sensory stimuli in the brain. And there's quite a lot of research these days that shows how when you read words, they will actually light up the areas in your brain associated with different flavors, different smells, if these are ones that you're already aware of. And so then what I've done is I combine that with a lot of Charles's work that he had done, where he compared different shapes to different flavors. So the whole kiki boba, you look at one of those and you associate it with sourness. You look at another one, you associate it with sweetness. So I thought, if you can do that with shapes, are we doing it with letter shapes when we read? And it turns out that we are. We just don't pay attention to it.
Is that research that triggered your interest in all of it? Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was literally meeting Charles and one of Heston's chefs at a Kitchen Theory event.
Oh, wow.
That triggered it all.
Because I guess around that same time, I was fascinated by that same phenomenon, this whole kind of idea of visual dominance, how we can link certain shapes to certain words, and how we can also link those shapes to flavor and textural perceptions in some way. And I guess as a chef, I took that away and looked at how we could map that on to flavor, and how we could look at creating dishes that, rather than just, I guess, categorizing ingredients in a more traditional way, but categorizing ingredients according to whether we found them to be more booba, which are typically associated with sweeter, creamier, richer, more comfort food kind of flavors, and kiki being the more tart, acidic, crispy, crunchy type of flavors. And so it was fascinating to me around that same time to see that there was someone coming from a graphic design background who was interpreting this research in their own kind of field and in their own way. Why, from your point of view, why is that interesting? Because from a chef point of view, I guess it allows me to experiment with flavors and ingredients using a slightly different lens or paradigm in terms of how I'm going to construct that dish. What is it from a kind of graphic design point of view that made you think, oh, well, this is actually really relevant and really interesting?
At that point, I'd actually taken a year out from being a graphic designer. So I decided, right, a year without clients, I'm just going to explore something, the weirder the better. Because if you take a year out, you don't want to explore the norm. And I started looking for research. There wasn't much. And I just thought, this is really fascinating. So if you're turning these into flavors, somebody else was turning them into textures. What if I try experimenting with different words and see how much influence? So for me, it's not about being a graphic designer. For me, it's about creating events. So what I do is I run lots and lots of events, and I do big talks where I do live experiments. So I just did a talk in Germany, and we gave the 1,000 people in the audience pairs of matching jelly beans. And I showed them words and played them sounds and asked them to pay attention to what their subconscious was kind of tuning into. Mm-hmm. And the majority of people did notice, did perceive what they could taste shifting. So it's more about showing all of us, creating these events where everybody can start exploring what's happening in our own subconscious mind, because I just think that's incredibly fascinating. And also to end but that's so niche phrase.
Yeah, sure. And I guess what's fascinating about this is that from a flavor and taste point of view, that a lot of the research into multisensory flavor perception is very relevant to our everyday lives, mm-hmm. right? Because we're constantly making judgments and expectations and decisions around what we're going to eat, how appetizing, how satiating we find foods. And in order to make those judgments, that's heavily reliant on that rich multisensory information being fed through the senses into the brain. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's exactly the same with words and fonts and typography. All of this is constantly a part of our, as you say, everyday life, especially in the realm of making food choices as well, or any choices, I guess. But so how is it that these fonts then, give us some examples of how are these affecting us? What kind of judgments are we making based on the type of words that we see?
So, and I will go back to how we read our environment in a moment, but in terms of the actual letter shapes, so it's extending what we know about Kiki and Boba. So we're drawn to things that look curvaceous. We tend to think they're going to be sweet or ripe. And things that look a little bit more jagged, we tend to think these are a little bit more aversive. So when I ask you to pair different flavors with the appearance of different words, you'll pair sourness with quite jagged letters. Bitterness seems to be jagged but a bit bolder. Sweetness tends to be curvy letters. Although I have to say there are lots and lots of exceptions, because you override this with things that you've learned. So if you've grown up and your favorite candy wrapper has curvy on sour letter shapes, you're going to have learned that is an association.
Right.
And also some of the research shows that even with Kiki Boba, there are some cultures where they will give the opposite answers to maybe the answers that I would give. So I think the exceptions also reveal really interesting stories about why have we learned to override these. And because as I'm sure you know, most of these go back to humans just trying to stay alive, to keep ourselves safe. So we're drawn to things that look nutritious, and we tend to be repelled by things that look dangerous. And then our brains create these really interesting metaphors that pair shapes and sounds and colors with styles of food or with styles of danger.
Well, it's interesting because I guess we live in a time where branding is kind of so important, right? And when I think of kind of Booba and Kiki, one example I give to people is saying, well, you see it every day, I guess, in marketing and branding and packaging. If you think of your brands like your Dairy's, your Cadbury's, your Galaxies, even just the way they all kind of finish on an E, and they're rounded, and the fonts, the colors, the tones. And then you have Kiki, which I know kind of from some of the work research that we've done, that you tend to find a lot of energy drinks, beers and sparkling waters have a star-like logo or angular graphics or something like that on the packaging. So is this something that is intuitive to us, that we just kind of pick up on without really realizing? Or is this all done in a very highly manipulative way?
I think there are layers. I think on one level it's really intuitive. So our ancestors, they scanned the horizon for danger. And there are a couple of books that talk about how when we learned to read, we rewired our brain and we co-opted different bits of our brain to learn to recognize letter shapes. And apparently one of the areas that we've kind of transferred is the part of our brain that used to very quickly recognize the silhouettes of potential attacking predators. And that's how we can recognize so many different type styles so quickly. So I really like this idea that our ancestors, or we've converted our old ancestor brain to this modern version where instead of looking for attacking predators, you're scanning packaging in a supermarket and you're understanding what kind of different flavors you're looking for.
Right.
So there's the very instinctive, I guess, almost like the sort of limbic responses, but then we've learned layers and layers. So you're talking about chocolate. One of the ones I love is a Kit Kat. So when chocolate was really expensive when it first came out, and Kit Kats were the first way that they'd worked out to make chocolate bars cheap enough for the everyday working person. And Kit Kat, and it was in the era of futurism. So you look at the shape of the Kit Kat logo, it's very angular. It actually looks like a futurist design. And Kit Kat is very kiki. It's not boba of chocolate, but because it's have a break, it's about the crunch. So they're teaching us that this is the differentiator between the really expensive creamy chocolate and the cheaper crunchy chocolate. So we learn all of these different layers. And so I don't work with big brands. Everything I do is all about crowdsourcing research, sharing it in books.
Okay.
So if there is a level of manipulation going on,
Nothing that you've got to do with.
I'm sure there is. I kind of feel like if you walk around a supermarket, you can see what research has been done just by looking at what's on the shelves.
And so with something like chocolate, for instance, why is it that when you tend to look at the creamier chocolates, they have that more swirly fonts and letters and graphics and all of that kind of stuff? What's that doing to the brain as people are looking at that before they even consume what's inside?
I think chocolate's a brilliant one because you've got a combination of conveying the quality of the flavors and textures, but also they need to tell you whether it's premium or cheap or child's chocolate. So the ones that have the curvier shapes tend to be the kind of middle to lower end price brackets. The higher up the price you go, the more minimalist, the more they're telling you we're premium, expensive chocolate. So it's this balance of the two. And I guess when we're scanning for the products, so the way our brains work when you go through something like a supermarket, it's so much stimulation. Your brain, your conscious brain is just going to go into meltdown like one of those science fiction computers when you confuse it. So if you had to look at every single product in the supermarket, you couldn't do that. So the whole thing that your site is very much a screening sense. In that kind of environment, you've already decided, okay, I want a luxurious, indulgent chocolate treat. So you're probably, unless it's a guilty pleasure chocolate, you're probably not going to go for the really curvy, sweet-looking ones. You're going to go for the more expensive chocolate where it's a given that it's going to be sweet. You sort of already know what the perception of flavor is or what the flavor experience is going to be. But you're looking now for another level of, I want an indulgent treat. And there's a lovely experiment, which gets very quoted, which is if I give you a glass of wine and I tell you the bottle costs £90, you will enjoy the wine much, much more than if it cost a fiver. So the same thing with chocolate. If you pay more, you are going to enjoy it more within reason.
Yeah, sure.
I do have an example about the opposite happening if you're interested.
I am. And I'm interested in incongruent examples that you might be kind of aware of, things that just where you've seen words and fonts that just are incongruent to the situation or the product that they are attached to.
Oh, so many examples. Because lots of the experiments I do, they're kind of mass participation. It's people in a room and I'm asking you questions. Whenever somebody gives me an answer that isn't what I expect, I always ask them what the story is because those are so much more interesting and they reveal really fascinating experiences. In terms of the chocolate, There is one brand of chocolate which graphic designers, I show them the packaging and they just cringe and they look like it's just hurting every sensibility in their body. And it's a type of Lindt chocolate that is banked up with lots of different hand-drawn typefaces. They all look really clashing, but they tell a story of the flavor. And apparently when these came out, they just flew off the shelves.
Really?
And so us as graphic designers, we overthink these things and we kind of forget that actually it's about an end user. I think one of my favorite and one of the first experiments I did that really taught me to think about incongruence or perception errors, because most of the time or prediction errors, because most of the time we kind of predict what we're going to experience from what we see, and then it'll either amplify our prediction when it's sort of close enough that we can feel smug and our biases kick in and we just look for confirmation that we were right in the first place, or maybe that doesn't happen. So I went along to, I think it was Food Matters Live with Charles and a lot of the cross-modal guys, Najib and Chris and all of those guys. And we were all running our wonderful, I loved that it was such an experimental, it was like we had created this new art school, this science and art school, and we just did these crazy experiments. Day one, I took along lots of really dark, lovely green and blacks chocolate, and I was asking people to taste the chocolate, look at just some instructions and to tell me how much they enjoyed it, how premium it tasted. And what I'd already done was a load of other experiments where I'd been able to create a scale of expensive to cheap words. So every half an hour, I was switching all of the materials, so the instructions, the answer sheets, everything between the expensive and the cheap typefaces. So people didn't really know I was doing it, asked them to rate premiumness and how much they enjoyed it. End of day one, tallied it all up. And when people had looked at the expensive type and they ate the lovely green and blacks, they rated it as tasting more premium and they enjoyed it more. So I was like, yes, this works.
Wow.
Day two, discovered that if you give people chocolate, your experiments are super popular. And I'm self-funded. So I went away and thought, okay, I'm just going to do it again with some cheap chocolate. So day two, cheap chocolate, did the same thing again, being very arrogant about, yeah, clearly this works. Tallied the results up at the end of the day, and not only had it not worked, but when people ate the cheap chocolate and looked at the expensive type, they rated it as tasting even cheaper and less enjoyable. And so that was when I was like, Charles, what have I done wrong? Have I just added it up wrong? And he was like, no. It was about congruence. So if there is this kind of band, it's like a Venn diagram, expectation and experience. And if you move them too far away, then not only will people not experience what you asked them to, it'll actually amplify the disappointment. And just that idea that there is this band of congruence, and as designers, we need to stop trying to pretend too much, was a really lovely lesson.
That's fascinating that in some way, just the font alone sets that kind of expectation, in the sense that the cheaper chocolate was rated as being even less enjoyable or palatable because of the expectation that was set by the typography that was there. So what kind of questions were they answering around this? What were you kind of trying to ascertain in terms of, they were eating the chocolate, and what were they trying to assess?
So I was just literally asking them, eat this piece of chocolate, and then just while you're looking at all of the materials here, rate how premium it tastes and rate how much you enjoy it. So give me a cost that you think the bar was, and I'd given them some examples. It was a scale.
Wow.
So all I was trying to do was measure whether type can actually make a difference. And I would need to go back and absolutely replicate this under proper scientific conditions to do it as a study, which I would love to do. But I think we kind of instinctively know the truth of the story.
But you have published with Professor Spence and some of the other colleagues that we have in common. What are some of those kind of lines of inquiry? What is it that you guys have been uncovering?
So the main ones we've looked into, so I've got a bank of new ones. So for me, it's really hard finding the number of people to take part in these and to run them under scientific conditions. So I have this big pile of studies ready to do, but the ones that we've published, we were looking at comparing different tastes to different shapes and then different typefaces. So we've now got this scale of which type will look more sweet, which will look sour, which will look bitter, which will look salty. And then the second study was the one where I give people pairs of jelly beans or give them a jelly bean, ask them to look at the letters taste like in either a jagged typeface or a curvy typeface. And again, they just rate how sweet or sour and how pleasant each one of them tasted. And we were able to show that just from looking at letter shapes alone, a lot of people do perceive a difference, even if the jelly beans are absolutely identical.
And does the color of the font, I'm guessing at some point that kicks in, right? In terms of the colors of words, that must play somewhat of a role as well. Have you tried anything in that kind of area, or is that kind of throwing in a added variable that muddies the water?
I think you know from the work you've done that colour absolutely changes everything. I remember one of the meals I came to was when you asked us to eat the little spherical jellies in order of sweet, sour, bitter, salty. And of course, we all got it wrong because of the colours. So I don't put colour in because it overrides. I think colour is probably stronger than type. I think type informs you about what you're going to expect in the way that you'd read packaging. And I think colour has a much more emotional strength to it. Or I've got another one I do where I get people to pair styles of coffee with different typeface shapes. And this one's actually quite a good one that would apply across the board. So if there is more contrast in the letters, people tend to associate that with more depth of flavor. Less contrast, they tend to think that's more bland, kind of more mono level.
Okay.
So, and things that are quite curvy tend to be a bit cheaper. Things that are a little bit more refined tend to be considered to be a bit more expensive. So even within the minimalist spectrum, you can still think about the actual shapes of the letters and how they fit within that. And then if you're looking at one of those, the places where you go to the big menu with lots of different things on it, you could have a lot of fun there at menu level, just playing with, okay, this one looks organic, this one looks sweet, that's the dessert, maybe this is the topsy-turvy thing. I think with restaurant menus, probably less, you don't want to confuse people too much, but I think there are also ways that, maybe not on the menu, but maybe in the way that each course arrives. If you're going to describe it, maybe at that point you could have a bit of play with something experiential in terms of a little note. See, I'm planning our dinner again here.
But talking about this idea of it kind of being sensory, you coined the term typo-sensory. Define typo-sensory for us so we can add that into our lexicon here at Kitchen Theory.
Brilliant, please do. I kept trying to explain what I do. It's not about, so if I talk about typography or fonts, then everybody thinks, you can see them either scrolling down the imaginary font menu in their mind, or you very much go into designer mode. You're thinking about how I use fonts. And that's not what I talk about. I talk about how you consume type and how, because of the way the brain works, it takes in stimuli, it takes in information from all of your different senses. And this is the whole idea of cross-modalism. And then it mixes them up together, and something that you might pull from one sense interacts with and informs another sense. So I'm adding type, the appearance of words, into the mix of all of that. So typography is literally the art of creating type or working with type, whereas typo-sensory is type and how it links to your senses. So how type will evoke a sensory response, whether it's mood, whether it's literally your senses.
So understanding the cross-modal impact that words and typography and fonts have.
Yes. And also just creating a new word resets the playing field a bit.
Yeah.
If nobody really understands what it is, then you can actually start putting meaning into it rather than you spending 10 years explaining, no, it's typography, but it's not typography. And typo-sensory is niche in a completely different way.
So tell us a little bit about your book, Why Fonts Matter. What inspired you to write it, and what is it that readers will gain through a read of it?
So, have you written a book?
Molecular Gastronomy at Home, published in
How long did it
2013.
take you to write?
I was under quite a bit of a deadline to write it, so I think I had all of something like about 7 months to write it. Yeah.
So you understand the insanity of I wrote mine in 6 months.
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Because usually people take a year, maybe 2 years to
Sure.
write a book because you're
Yeah.
fitting it around other things.
Yeah.
And I was kind of falling asleep on my keyboard because I'd given myself this deadline and
Wow.
then had to keep it. So Why Fonts Matter is, I wrote it 6 or 7 years ago now. So I'm now currently working on the new one, which is like the second album, which takes a while to put together. And Why Fonts Matter it was 2 years after I'd started type tasting.
Okay.
And the name for that actually came about from, I was thinking about wine tastings and could I do just short social ways of explaining typography? And then just the serendipity of the name happened to mean that I could now apply it to all of this multisensory world. And I'd spent this year, 2 years, kind of gathering all of this data, doing all of these big mass participation events, and started to really gather up the content for this. And when I'd looked into it, there was hardly any research in the area. You could find stuff from like the early 1900s, but and Carlos and Charles had published a couple of early studies. And then I just thought, oh my goodness, if I don't put it in a book, somebody else will do it first. And I started trying to find publishers and everybody was like, no, we don't want another book about typography. So I self-published it.
Oh, wow.
But then sold pretty much all my copies, and within 6 months, Penguin picked it up. So it's now
Wonderful.
sellable everywhere, all around the world. It's just being translated into Italian as we speak. So it's not from the graphic designer's point of view. It takes you through 2 years of my discoveries in how type kind of does more from the type consumer's point of view. It tends to be students love it, especially graphic design students, because it gives them an into typography, which is traditionally quite an intimidating academic topic. And I kind of really wanted to debunk that because we all consume words every day. They're fun, they're exciting, they shouldn't have gatekeepers telling you, oh no, you've got to look at the kerning, and oh no, you've got to use those typefaces because we say so. That's really boring.
And so how is this going to influence, like what would you like to see type tasting kind of influence with young designers, new products? What would you like to see result? Because I'll give you an example. So from the work that we do with Professor Spence, understanding the sensory and psychological relationship that people have with food, I guess our mission here at Kitchen Theory is really looking at how these ideas can be applied to improve people's relationship with food, how we can nudge and encourage people towards making more healthier, more sustainable food choices, how we can look at the learnings of this research and apply them within schools, care homes, hospitals. And I guess that for me is what makes the research that we do really interesting. I mean, aside from the fact that it results in kind of weird, wonderful, multi-sensory dining experiences, that's the fun part of it. But in terms of, I guess the ambition with the research and where this is headed, at the core of it is really that desire to see that research being taken out of the lab and finding practical applications for it that hopefully in some way can, I guess, solve a piece of the puzzle around the kind of growing concerns and issues resulting from poor diet and malnutrition all over the world. And I guess in a similar vein, where is it that you see this kind of research impacting the world of kind of graphic design, products, people's everyday lives?
So many answers. Right. So one aspect in terms of making a difference, how we communicate healthier food choices, how one of the areas that's always fascinated me is if I can make you make your perception of a jelly bean sweeter just from the packaging alone. Could we then start to use that almost like a placebo? How long does that effect last for? Does it need to be on the packaging? There's kind of lots of really interesting experiments, and also the way that language plays so profoundly into your experiences. If you tell somebody, there was a study that was just published recently about how malleable your sense of smell is. If you tell somebody that that's going to smell of something particular, they will that's what they will smell. They will perceive it as more strongly in that direction. And I've done the same thing with word shapes. So how can we start using this in a responsible way? Again, knowing that if you walk around a supermarket, it's used in a seductive way, I would guess. So how can we start, us who are not behind the NDAs, how can we start kind of co-opting this understanding? In terms of designers, just making them love type, but also understanding that as designers, we are allowed to experiment. We shouldn't just make assumptions. One of my bugbears is the way that for a long time, graphic design has been very minimalist, very modernist, and we foist this good taste on the rest of the world. And we shouldn't do that. It should be a conversation. We should be asking questions, not telling. So I think just encouraging designers to be much, much more curious and to also listen and to not just assume that Helvetica is the right typeface for everything. So shaking that up a little bit, but also getting past the intimidating side of it. But the thing that really excites me is how, if you just look at the way our brains respond to the words, the appearance of the words we read, it sounds like a very tiny little kind of almost molecular level, I guess, or a tiny little metaphor, but you can expand it out and start to understand how we engage with the world around us, how our brain makes assumptions, how it predicts that chocolate is going to taste expensive, and then it looks for proof that it's right. So it's a way of unpicking so much about human experience and about human behavior, about diversity, cultural diversity, perceptual diversity, neurodiversity, just from looking at how every single one of us responds to and engages with the way we read very, very differently.
You just actually brought up a really interesting point there that I hadn't considered in this whole conversation, which is, have you done any kind of research around these fonts in other languages? Because I'm just thinking about a language like Arabic, which I'm familiar with the typography of. And just thinking that a lot of the letters tend to be a bit more curlier in their natural kind of form, although they do have obviously typographies that straighten all that out and make it a bit more kind of linear. But has there been any research in other language?
So I haven't, but I would love to, because I grew up in England. I would never presume to understand another language, but I would love to collaborate with and extend this. So yeah, I agree, it's fascinating. So if a language is, huge amounts of the world have very brush script based languages. We look at India as well, is very similar. Would the natural curviness of the letters override our assumptions about sweet, sour, bitter? I don't know the answer.
Yeah, versus something I'm just thinking like Mandarin or even Chinese, Japanese letters that are quite linear. Right, and that's fascinating.
So would you be looking at nuance? One thing I taught in India for a little while, but I was teaching as an English person in an international university. And what was fascinating was when I asked the students to pair flavors, associations with all of the different Roman typefaces I took with me, they were very similar to the pairings that I would find in the UK and the US. And presumably because when we've exported all the products, we've exported the typefaces, we've exported the associations. And it would have been really interesting to unpick this and get the students to look at some different styles. You're talking about the difference between Arabic as well. I think there are really basic, so cultural diversity. I think type is a really interesting way of starting to unpick this. So imagine a poster and you've got two different posters. One poster, somebody's looking in one direction, the other poster, somebody's looking in in the opposite direction. And I asked you which of those faces is pointing or looking towards the future, or which one is walking towards the future. If you grew up reading in English, chances are you're going to say that the character looking from left to right is looking to the future. But if you grew up reading Arabic, you're going to pick the other direction. So this is very, very fundamental cultural diversity that comes from the direction that we read in. And we don't think about it, again, because it's so niche and so invisible, but it has a profound influence on how we visualize and engage with how we see the world around us. So adverts, if you're a designer designing for another country, you need to know which way the car should be driving in if you want the car to be driving into the future. When we try to read political posters through history, it's all very well saying, oh, the ones telling the truth or looking to the future or looking in that direction, or even the whole thing about somebody telling the truth looks in one direction, or somebody thinking about the past. Again, it depends. What language did they grow up reading? Where do they live now? What cultural influences do they have?
That's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that idea, because as soon as you mentioned that example of the two posters, for me, it would be the person, facing towards the right.
I have no internal compass, so for me, I can't even.
Well,
spin
I'm really
myself
bad
around.
with left and right, so yeah. Apparently.
I do kickboxing, and I have to have jab and cross written on my boxes even after 15 years because I still can't remember left and right.
Well, the worst thing is when I'm driving and someone's saying, go left, I'm turning right.
Other left.
Right. So yeah, it is. Yeah, other left. Yeah. So Sarah, where can people find out more about your work?
So if you come to my website, which is type tasting, as in eating, not testing, .com, there's lots of experiments that I'm updating. So I am literally writing a new book as we speak, and I'm starting to do, instead of doing a book tour, I'm doing a pre-book tour where I'm taking lots of these experiments because I'd love to include everybody in the conversations, because this book is going to be a book full of experiments. So I'm going to ask you to do an experiment, then I'm going to get you to compare it to the results I've got in the past, and then explain why your result might or might not match.
Oh, wow.
Because I really want to encourage this kind of experimentation mindset because it's fun.
Amazing. Now, before I bid you farewell, every guest who comes on the show, so I like playing around with generative AI and Mid-Journey and generating kind of images of dishes, and we're constantly at Kitchen Theory trying to create kind of themed experiences and dishes. And so every guest that comes on, I take on as a kind of opportunity to create a dish that is themed around their work, their research or character. And I have this here for you.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. That's amazing.
So this is a very healthy looking dish, because I know from looking at kind of the work, and you just explained a moment ago how maybe one of the potentials of your research is that kind of part of that nudging people towards making better, more nutritional, more sustainable food choices. And I kind of like the way the ingredients all came out in a kind of quite organic place.
But also the tomatoes and the chilies sitting around the edge, are those red ones going to be sweet, or are they going to bite me with spiciness? I like the potential jeopardy in that as well. That's wonderful. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for coming into the studio. Your work is absolutely fascinating. And now we need to discuss how we're going to work on bringing some of your research and work into our chef's table. The menus at the end that we give out to people seem like a really good, and also maybe the.
Oh no,
you've already got the. Okay, well there we go. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I could have talked to you about this all day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.